Today marks a turning point that most Americans aren't even aware of yet. While the news cycle remains fixated on Washington's internal dramas, the foundation of global trade underwent a massive restructuring in New Delhi. The European Union and India just finalized a comprehensive trade deal that's been in the works, on and off, for about 20 years. The timing tells you everything you need to know about where we stand right now. This happened days after what many observers are calling the worst diplomatic crisis NATO has experienced in its entire existence. We're not just talking about a trade agreement here. This represents a fundamental shift in how global power is being reorganized. The world's two most populous democracies just built an economic partnership that pointedly excludes the United States. And they did it because trust in Washington has evaporated.
Let me walk you through why this matters for everyday Americans. Because the consequences are going to hit farmers in Iowa, factory workers in Michigan, and consumers across the country in ways most people haven't anticipated. To understand what just happened, you need to know what triggered this acceleration. Last Thursday, President Trump went on Fox Business and made comments that sent shockwaves through every Allied capital. While defending his threats to pull out of NATO, he suggested that American allies in Afghanistan, countries like Britain, Canada, Germany, and Poland, stayed away from the actual fighting and left American troops to carry the burden alone. The response was immediate, and unlike anything we've seen in modern transatlantic relations. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer didn't issue some carefully crafted diplomatic statement. He publicly called the comments appalling and insulting, and you could hear genuine anger in his voice. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius went even further, breaking with decades of diplomatic protocol by appearing on television to demand a formal apology. He called it disrespectful to discuss Allied casualties that way, and said the claims were simply false. The reaction was so strong because the actual facts completely contradict what was said. The United Kingdom lost 457 service members in Afghanistan. That's 457 families who got that knock on the door. Canadian forces lost 158. Germany lost 59. Denmark, when you look at population size, suffered some of the highest casualty rates in the entire coalition. These weren't soldiers sitting in safe zones guarding supply depots. They were in Helmand province. They were in Kandahar. They were running combat patrols right alongside American Marines, facing the same terrain, the same improvised explosives, dying in the same dust. When the American president characterizes that sacrifice as staying back, he's not making a policy argument. He's sending a message to allied nations that their blood sacrifice means nothing to him. What the media coverage is missing is that this wasn't just an emotional wound. It was a strategic wake-up call. European leaders have spent years hoping the current situation was temporary. They thought they could wait it out, manage the relationship carefully, preserve the alliance through patient diplomacy. That hope died last Thursday. Think about it from their perspective. If the American president won't even acknowledge the ultimate sacrifice made by their soldiers who fought alongside Americans, why would they believe he'd honor treaty commitments to defend their borders? NATO's Article 5 guarantee, the promise that an attack on one member triggers a collective response, only functions if member nations believe their partners actually value the alliance. That belief just collapsed. So Europe stopped waiting. They stopped hoping. They started building alternatives. What happened in New Delhi on January 27, 2026, will likely be marked by historians as a pivotal date. The European Commission is calling this the most significant trade agreement in the Union's history, and the numbers back that up. This deal creates a unified market of over 2 billion consumers. That's more than 6 times the population of the United States. It eliminates tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India, and that's remarkable because India has historically maintained some of the most protective trade barriers on the planet. India doesn't open its markets lightly. They've spent decades rejecting trade liberalization to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. For Europe, they just made a massive exception. Look at automobiles as an example. European manufacturers trying to sell cars in India have been facing tariffs of 110%. That's not a trade barrier, that's a wall. Under this new agreement, that drops to 10%. Think about what that means for German automakers like Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW. They're currently getting squeezed by tariffs in the American market, and their sales projections for the United States are declining. Now they suddenly have nearly tariff-free access to 1.45 billion potential customers in one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. They didn't lose a market. They swapped a declining one for an expanding one. The concessions span multiple sectors. Wine tariffs that were at 150% are being eliminated. Machinery tariffs of 44%, gone. Chemical tariffs of 22%, gone. Pharmaceutical barriers, eliminated. In exchange, India gets tariff-free access for 99% of its exports to Europe. Textiles, leather goods, jewelry, industries that employ tens of millions of Indian workers now have direct access to Paris, Berlin, Milan, and Madrid. The timing creates perfect strategic alignment. Indian exporters who are now facing new American reciprocal tariffs of 25 to 40% suddenly have a European door swinging wide open. European manufacturers facing American tariff walls of 15 to 25% suddenly have an Indian door swinging wide open. This is economic competition being conducted through partnership rather than punishment, and the United States is the target. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was pretty explicit about this in New Delhi, when she said this agreement demonstrates that rules-based cooperation delivers results. That statement is aimed at exactly one person, and the message translates pretty simply. We don't need you to prosper. Now let me explain what I mean by strategic exclusion, because you can't formally kick a nation out of the global economy. There's no mechanism for that. But you don't need one. What happens instead is quieter, but just as effective. Intelligence sharing becomes more selective. Trade routes get redrawn to bypass certain ports. Summit meetings, where the real decisions get made, increasingly happen in hallways before the formal sessions even begin. The G7 risks becoming the G6+1, where the American president shows up to find that key agreements have already been reached. This is happening right now in real time. While the United States pulls back from international organizations citing globalist agendas, the rest of the world is constructing new institutions that simply don't include Washington. The isolation isn't being imposed from outside. It's being built through systematic exclusion. Consider what's happening in European strategic thinking. For years, the concept of strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should develop independent defense capabilities, was mostly academic. Brussels bureaucrats discussed it in position papers. Nobody treated it as urgent. Today, it's become a survival strategy. The EU-India agreement contains substantial provisions on defense and security cooperation. They're not just trading consumer goods. They're discussing maritime coordination in the Indo-Pacific, cybersecurity frameworks, intelligence sharing protocols. These are conversations Europe used to have exclusively with Washington. Now they're having them with New Delhi. India is making parallel calculations. The Quad Alliance, the partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia that was designed to counterbalance Chinese influence, looked promising a couple years ago. India was a cornerstone member, but American unpredictability has changed the equation. Tariffs on Indian goods, threats to restrict visas, erratic policy shifts that make long-term planning nearly impossible. Indian strategists are diversifying their partnerships. They're betting that a relationship with Europe offers more stability than alignment with an administration that changes positions on a weekly basis. So what does this mean for Americans who aren't tracking geopolitical developments closely? What's the actual impact on ordinary people? The isolation of the United States carries real economic costs, and they're not theoretical. They're already starting to materialize. The current administration believes tariffs will force manufacturing to return to American soil. They're calling it economic revival, and there have been some investment announcements. Japan pledged significant manufacturing commitments last year, but economists will tell you that corporate pledges and actual factory construction are two very different things. Commitments evaporate when conditions change, and the immediate reality is inflationary pressure. When you impose 25% tariffs on imported goods, prices go up for American consumers. That's not complicated economics, that's basic math. But the deeper danger is market displacement. American agricultural producers, soybean farmers in Iowa, corn growers in Nebraska, wheat producers across the Midwest, they depend heavily on export markets. When Europe and India create a tariff-free trading zone between themselves, American farmers find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. A French agricultural producer can now sell to Indian buyers without tariff costs. An American producer faces barriers. When an Indian importer is choosing between suppliers, they're going to choose the cheaper option. This is what economists call trade diversion. It happens gradually. It doesn't make headlines, but it quietly destroys market positions that took decades to build. The EU-India agreement gives European companies first-mover advantage in a market of nearly 1.5 billion people. By the time American policymakers recognize the strategic error and try to negotiate competing access, the market will already be captured. Indian store shelves will be stocked with German appliances, French wines, Italian fashion. We're surrendering the market of the future because we're consumed by grievances from the past. The projections are pretty stark. By 2030, EU-India trade volume is expected to double. At the same time, U.S.-European trade is projected to decline by 15% because of ongoing tariff conflicts. Superpowers don't lose their status in dramatic battles. They lose it because the rest of the world figures out how to do business without them. We can't discuss this realignment without talking about the Greenland situation. And I know it sounds absurd. It is absurd, but it's actively accelerating NATO's fracture. President Trump has renewed demands that Denmark sell Greenland to the United States. Denmark has refused again. The response has been threats of tariffs against a NATO ally. The Arctic context matters here. Climate change is opening shipping routes and resource access that didn't exist before. Greenland's strategic value is increasing. American interest makes geopolitical sense, but the method is catastrophic. By threatening a loyal NATO member with economic punishment for refusing to sell sovereign territory, the administration has terrified every small country in the alliance. Sweden, Finland, Norway, they're watching Denmark's treatment and drawing conclusions. The United States is no longer being viewed as a protector. It's being viewed as a potential threat. This has pushed Nordic nations deeper into European Union defense mechanisms and further away from NATO's American-led command structure. Every threat adds another brick to the wall of isolation. Historians will probably identify January 2026 as an inflection point, the moment when the Eurasian Rim decided to integrate without Atlantic participation. The administration promised to prioritize American interests, and in a certain sense that promise has been fulfilled. America is now first in isolation, first in tariff rates, but last in the rooms where the future is actually being negotiated. The exclusion isn't formalized. No document officially expels the United States from anything. But when allies build new economic systems that bypass you, when they sign historic agreements without you, when they're demanding apologies for your dismissal of their sacrifices, the practical effect is identical. The agreement is signed, the terms are set, tariff walls are rising on one side, while they're falling on the other. Welcome to the restructured global order. For the first time in a century, the United States is navigating alone. The consequences will unfold over months and years. The American response, likely additional tariffs, will probably arrive within days. Watch the trade flows. Watch the diplomatic appointments. Watch which summits produce real outcomes and which ones produce only photo opportunities. Those signals will tell you whether this realignment accelerates or stabilizes, and they'll tell you what kind of economic future American workers and families should be preparing themselves for. The world didn't wait for permission to move forward.